We're going to start with the two panelists that were in session 1. I am not going to go into the details of what they do and who they are, because you all have that information on the bios. So without further notice, we're going to start. Is that okay if we start with you?
That's fine.
Excellent, thank you, Tanya.
Hi everyone, thank you organizers. I think the University of Florida always sets the highest bar for how you run processes like this when you're doing the event. Great to see old friends meet new friends. I've got 5 minutes, right? I was told to pick the vision of the condor. I guess that implies that we're scavengers of sorts. Also, we can see things far away. I want to go back to Bali Papan. I'm sure everyone knows where Bali Papan is, in the east coast of East Kalimantan, where I was last week, until Saturday afternoon, actually. But we had the governors of subnational governments, of the governments representing 85% of the Amazon at that meeting as part of the Governor's Climate Force Task Force. And the main theme underlying dialogues was how can governments succeed on the agenda we're talking about at this meeting. And with Xiaomiana there, who's hopefully will have his successor, with Prefecto Pio Branco, continue the Diana legacy for another 8 years. Confucio Mora from Honduras, not sure. Takis didn't make it, Jatene Simon backed out, or had a conflict. Victor Noriega ending his term in San Martin. All of these leaders are not sure if this agenda works to remain elected, and I think that's a problem. If we look today at Brazil, we're facing an existential crisis of what the socio-environmental movement has built in Brazil. The biggest, most powerful political lobby in Congress, the Ruralistas, the French Parlamentar Agropecuária, they own Michel Temer. They will probably own a big share of the priorities of the next president and many of the elected officials across Brazil. And for me, that is the biggest sign that something's wrong. And I would point to narrative. Our sessions were fascinating, talking about knowledge, talking about stakeholder processes, talking about indigenous knowledge. But if we don't get the narrative right, we will lose. If the way we package information is not going to drive people towards this agenda, we will lose. You know, it was already mentioned, we're losing in this country on climate change. And I think some of the dynamic we see with Trumpism is very applicable in Brazil, where to bash Trump, to beat up Trump, strengthens a big part of the space. And is that happening in Brazil? I think the questions boil down to, in some ways, do we want, I love Fabio's comments because he always brings in the business end. And can we make the Amazon business friendly? Right now, it's one of the worst places in the world to do business. It's a bureaucratic nightmare. It's number 140 on one of the indices I looked at recently. The time it takes up to set up business, the time it takes to get your licenses, if you're a farmer, or get infrastructure licenses. These are real issues. But if we make it really hard for responsible companies to do business in the Amazon, the irresponsible companies will take over. In many ways, that's what's happening. I think that there's, thinking about the topics we discussed in our session, there's few simple things that can change. One is we need to celebrate success, not just among our organizations here, but among farmers, among businesses operating in the Amazon. We need to join forces to make the Amazon business friendly. We have and Vera Dunn from NDP, amazing institution, but trying to implement a very complex regulatory structure. We need streamlining without losing goals of those norms and regulations. We are fairly far along in finishing a jurisdictional sustainable soil sourcing deal between Brazil and the animal rations industries of the EU, the biggest importer of soy in the EU, TEFAC, fatty oil for vegetable oils, and a similar deal with China. If brought to fruition, these two deals would send a very positive signal to big business, agribusiness, and soy farmers. It would go a long way in saying what you guys are doing is recognized internationally. And if there's an incentive built into it, and there's ways to do that, that makes it even more powerful. We need a price premium for soy. There's a demand for that. And a tiny price premium would address the consistent and accurate comment made by the enemy, big business, and the ruralistas, which is there's very little recognition for what they're doing. They're rolling out this. There are no carrots. We have a shortage of carrots. I think for the indigenous people's knowledge agenda and rights agenda, last week in Valley Kapan was launched the working group of the GCF for indigenous people, because there's some amazing partnerships that are taking place. We see it most in Acre, but also in Mongolia. I think the process is starting now in Mato Grosso to get beyond the idea that subnational governments don't have a role to play with indigenous people. It's all a national government issue. And it's in those much more local dialogues that can emerge partnerships that address some of the critical issues faced by indigenous people. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Megan McDowell, and I'm with the Andes Amazon Fund. I wanted to introduce my perspective because I'm coming very much from a results perspective. We are focused very specifically on new legal designation of protected areas of indigenous lands in the Andes and Amazon. And we also are wanting governments to invest more in the protected areas of indigenous lands that they already have. So this is where we're trying to get. So I'm looking at decision support tools. I'm thinking about how will they get us to this goal. And there have been many fantastic examples of specific decision support tools used in the context of kind of like the INDCs or many other particular contexts. And my only concern is how the scalability question, and also how do we make it, rather than one-off projects, how do we really design these decision support tools to address very specific windows of opportunity for government change. And for this to happen, I think we need to make sure that the academics and the NGOs and the funders and everyone get more involved with the governments where there's any entree to see what is the timing of the political processes in which these decisions are being made. New things come up all the time, and if we're not on top of what are the opportunities, we're going to miss them. So if we design a beautiful decision support tool, it's not necessarily going to help if our window isn't aligned with the timing of that decision. So again, I've seen great progress in terms of how these decision support tools are being designed in terms of participation, involving local communities and indigenous people. But now the question is how do we get the information to the people who need to hear it at the right time? And I know we'll be talking more about communications and outreach strategies tomorrow, but it's particularly important to think about who could be the right spokespeople who can take what could be a very technical study and put it in language that the particular decision makers understand and care about. You have to take into account a world view, because talking about biodiversity indicators might not register. So we'll need a lot more translation. One other point is that since there are such great separate projects being designed, but if they could be more standardized, to be more scalable, that would be incredibly helpful. If a process is taking place at one local site, can use similar data or indicators that can feed into the next level, municipality or regional government, et cetera, and be used. And the more we can have standard data and standard formats, get everything integrated into online systems that are open access, all of that. So I think events like this, where we bring people from different disciplines together to talk about these, compare what they're doing at different sites, see how it's relevant to the next level up in scale, is particularly valuable.
Daniel and Megan, they were actually part of the panel from session 1. So we're now going to step into the session 2. So Juliana and Enrique, you want to give the title of the session to remember?
Yes, the title of my session might either be called Monitoring of Dynamic Processes with Application to Environmental Management, or it can also be called No Excuse of Lack of Information. But, so let's talk a little bit about that. Just to introduce myself, I'm Juliana. I work for the Amazon Fund and the Brazilian Development Bank, which is responsible for managing the fund, which was launched in 2008 as part of the United Nations Negotiations on Climate. And our main donors currently is Norway government, the KfW, the German Development Bank, and the rest of the Brazilian oil and gas company. We have $1 billion of donations so far. 1.1 to be more precise, and half of it already accomplished 89 projects in different areas. In particularly, talking about monitoring, that was the main in information availability and intelligence and strategies to combat or either prevent deforestation, burning, and so on. I saw a huge connection with what we've been supporting with the Amazon Fund at this moment. One diagnosis was shown in the session is that a reality that currently deforestation in the Amazon are a lot focused in smaller patches. So it turns to be more difficult to monitor, more expensive to combat, to control deforestation. So this is a challenge of how to incorporate all this data, all this information to put a strategy that engages more people, civil society in general, and the local communities that live in the forest and from the forest. It was showing kind of like the evolution of monitoring the past year. So talking about INPI, the National Space Research Institute, we have the projects, we have the DES system, we have data classes, the use of the land. We have civil society and pass on with the status system that adds information and helps municipalities to identify areas of deforestation. We have Basic Fund, which is a project in the Ministry of Defense that the Amazon Fund supports, and it's actually under implementation, that aims to support orbital radar monitoring that will be associated, coupled in satellites. So you will be able to have information throughout the clouds, identify forested areas throughout the country, which the satellites cannot see currently. We have the forest code that between the positive and negative practices, it will be a very important policymaker instrument and monitoring system after all the each individual rural property is included in a national system. All the georeferenced area, identifying what is forest, what is being used in a production manner, what is an area that has to be preserved based on its biodiversity and closeness to the rivers and watersheds. So this will be a very important tool to monitor the use of the land and to make each individual property owner or the ones that occupy the land that declare that the occupants accountable for the regular or irregular use of the land. And as you might know, 80% of each individual land, particularly in the Amazon, has to be preserved based on the forest code. And we have other systems implemented in Iran. For example, they just launched last year the Law, that is a very comprehensive system to monitor the production chain of wood. So you have all the information of each individual tree up to the time it ends the production chain. We have, it was shown, the strength of the Panelists last that shows information in almost a daily basis on a specific area. So in the near future, we have information of when the trees were cut. So this is something very amazing. So the next step, just to finalize my time is almost done, I think, is how to integrate all those information, lots of information that we currently have, engaging not only the specialists and people, and the practitioners on the ground and the governmental institutions, but also regular people, I can say that. So it was shown the importance of citizen science that engage local communities, local people in provide input for scientists and qualify the information and data that they use. So I think this is something important. And talking about the recent scenarios, especially in Brazil, of let's say political instability, or some might say the ruralist empowerment and some laws or influences that pass. I think there is the other side of the half up, full or empty. We have to look at these actually brought the society in a mobilization process. These brought celebrities. These brought my friends that are not engaged in environmental discussions. So these brought these discussions to our regular talking. So I think this is part of this process of self-understanding and broader understanding of society in general, the importance of the Amazon to our lives, to the climate balance, and also to our economic growth, including agriculture, including other economic challenges that Brazil still have and will continue to have. So we have to face and integrate those challenges.
Well, several of you know me from having lived in different paths. I am involved in this field not as long as Tom, 50 years, but I've been involved in this in the 70s and in different capacities. As an activist, also as a researcher and scientist, in the museum, in the Smithsonian. And in the last 80 years, I'm part of the foundation of foundations, in the fourth foundation right now. And in the same case again, now when I see the world more in the view of results. I still do science, I still read about science, but I'm more concerned about what we do, what the results of what we do. So part of our panel was about monitoring, and it's pretty cool to see people getting excited about new tools, new techniques, flying from outside. But I always want to come back to the question, so what? What do we do? And when we see the numbers today, Brazil is picking up again deforestation. Colombia has 40% more than last year. Losing last year, Peru had the second highest deforestation figures in history. Bolivia is also the same story. So are we doing the right thing? What is the result of all what we do? So, unquestionably, technology has produced immense information and is opening lots of possibilities. Now, in fact, today we have too much information to the point where it's hard to understand and hard to believe what you read and what you see. When you look at the figures, for example, carbon sinks or emitters, the forest 3 years ago there was a paper calculating previous It's very hard to understand what's going on. And imagine your politician and decision maker, it's just confusing. I always remember in one of the MAP meetings, 4 years around, there was a guy that I was the director of CI Bolivia and Guillermo Rioja. And in the meeting, he started saying, and all science and environmentalists for documenting disasters. So one of the challenges is now, what do we do with the information we have and with the technology we have? How do we translate that into political action? After many years involved in the field, I'm more convinced that political action is a very key element where we have to be really that we need lobbies. We should do the same, we should use the same techniques as other fields use, politics and so on. So in the last few years, working with Megan, I'm not dealing directly now with politics and more lobbies. Lobbies for conservation. That's what I do now. I'm talking to presidents, ministers, all the way to practitioners in the field. And it's a pretty critical role today how to translate our knowledge, our capacity into political capital, into political information. Political capital is an important one. And today, as you know, we only see that politicians care about being related. And you have to change our story, our narrative, into something that makes sense and political terms without having visionaries. Governance is an issue that requires a lot of efforts. As a funder, we have a number of limitations, for example, for funding governments, different scales, national, regional, or global. But developing governance, including judiciary capacity or enforcement, is critical. And it would be good to analyze the way that our information supports those governance levels. And there are a number of examples that were mentioned today that were actually very interesting. Some of them are showing good results. One of the, we have to think about what is the positive again. I'm trying to be optimistic and hard. But when we think about changing paradigms, right? We develop a new paradigm of conservation action, as I said there. We have had tremendous successes by general insurance animal policy. Sure, we're slowing down the issues, but still we're not there. And one of the questions is how do we get out of the box? How do we involve other views and other perspectives in what we do? We have here, for example, the board asking how many regarding communications. And today, communication is one of the missing elements in our world. When I ask you how many outlets of information is real by not by us, by somebody else that exists today, in Brazil and many sources in the world, from very limited for able. Also, those only the ones that are used are produced by environmental organizations which are very funded by very small city. Same goes for Peru, same goes for Colombia, and so on. So we look at our need strengthening our communication capacity. And it's a critical factor that I see that we're missing out. Probably today, Monterrey is the most effective of all, but still very limited. I still go to the people and ask, and we're going to say, which ones? I don't know. So anyway, that's one of the challenges that we need to develop more. And finally, the last point is the issue of context. We are working in a world that is sort of our own bubble, but there is a political context. As you see, for example, the reality today is very different than it was 5 years ago. All the scandals in Brazil was still over all the whole region. What's happening in Colombia, all these big numbers of deforestation are a byproduct of this process. Case in Peru, change governments and then a completely different scenario, very clear where the direction is going. So even though we as scientists have this vision, but we are not isolated from political context. And I wonder, what is the way to actually introduce more these changes in political context into our work? I was reading a few days ago that, for example, soil production of Paraguay, Brazil, and the US together, that the demand of soil in China will be more than those three countries combined. Population issues, so we need to be developing a bit more about what is to tax in some way, develop more thinking of where are we going, a way that we can actually look beyond what is our own project here and there.
Ricardo and David, you're going to focus on the theme of the third session, right?
That's about learning and adaptation. How to learn, how to challenge and try to use logical, do something great for the future. I just, after this session in the morning, come also with two different words that for me are key. One is time, and the other is scaling up. What is time for us about learning? Think about learning cycle, develop as an agenda, like participatory way or another way. Have implement agenda, have work towards somehow, like have knowledge of this learning cycle, and put another that we're doing better. And what we see in the past of our discussion here, suppose that take long time to be mature. The cycles are quickly, have to more people, have to negotiate, have to have coalitions, have to have a lot of things. That's not happening quickly. If you go to another place and discuss, for example, climate change, what I would like to know is when people think about climate change, the time will be freeze. And no more than 20, 30 years to change not one minute, but forward. And how we synchronize such a that's a challenge that we have to face these two agendas that we have in the table today, and how to think about synchronizing these two. If we believe that climate change is really happening, it's going to affect even things that are working now, how we synchronize this agenda is key. The other key is scaling up. How we do it the way we are doing today. Have like a kind of isolated process. It's not a lot of good initiatives, with pilot projects, with examples, but how we use this example in this scale, which is knowledge that we're discussing today. That's a new process, but there's a lot of backgrounds, there's a lot of moments. It's not something that's new. No, but it's either not, like mentioned, they're not doing good service and selling as something that's could be not mind if people are deciding today how to resolve scale up what they're doing today. And the third one is Two, and I have third one, that's engagement. Learn is not, it's about how to spread the word. It's how to learn, and not for yourself, but for others, and how to engage others in this process in this speed way that you can use them in schema to do answer to the whole climate change perspective. I don't have like was last guys to have like let's say it's opportunities and how to go forward. But in the past, I passed on some process that could help me to understand like some possible pathways. I worked in Amazon for like since the 90s, and at that time I had strong networks for small orders, e-earnings, CDFs, landless people, and strong. They could even come to a place like Washington and make the point here. And today, as some of the indigenous groups have a little bit to grow, but also strong that was in the past. And how we as people, practitioners, to NGOs stronger, how we can, in fact, see how to improve networks. If you look at processors in computers, they start alone or not some parallel process. As if you do like alone, not going anywhere, but you like parallel process working similarly, we a lot of knowledge, less information, and try to build another level of knowledge and our science. It's not easy, but I think that I have to prove about doing natural. Yeah. Other thing that's talk a lot as a climate change as a magical process. It's how to engage people in directions as sweet for not for only peers but others. How make a meeting, for example, doing good business in Amazon. How important it is to develop good case or communities working together with some local experience. It's all about learning, but it's important to produce information, how to manage and use the information informally. That's the topics I want to bring. Thank you.
We talked about a lot of different interesting topics in the morning, but I want to focus my comments this afternoon on 4 concepts which I think are key to this discussion. The first is knowledge. The second is knowledge management. The third is objectives. And the fourth is power. In terms of knowledge, we tend to talk about knowledge as something that's rational, evidence, intellectual, facts, data. But the truth is that that way of thinking about how people think and respond to things is not scientific. Science tells us that people react with their hearts and their minds. Science tells us that in this world, people filter everything they receive through their emotions, through their identities, through the images, through the sounds, through how they're feeling in the moment, and they take on the information that they receive based on whether they consider the source credible, whether the people who provide that source is one of them or one of us, whether that source fits with their values. whether that source fits with their beliefs. So when we talk about knowledge separate from the way that real people react when they get information, we're not being scientific, we're being anti-scientific. And anybody living in the post-Trump, post-fact, post-truth world who hasn't internalized those basic facts is going to keep hitting up against some very big walls and batting their heads against some very big walls. If we don't internalize the way people filter, receive, understand all these things we're talking about, then it's not knowledge in the sense that we tend to think of it. Now, if we go from knowledge to knowledge management, then what that tells me, what I just said about knowledge, tells me that I should be as concerned about the demand as I should be about the supply. Most people tend to think of knowledge management about how do I organize my supply of data and evidence and publications and this and that, but not who is the audience. What does the audience believe? What are their values? Which identities do they have? Which groups do they respond to as them and us? What motivates them? Who do they trust? Knowledge management needs to be much more about the demand, much more about our identifying the audiences and understanding the audiences, and much less about supplying data and models and evidence and papers and so and so. Now, that brings us to objectives. If we want to manage the knowledge, what objectives are we going to manage it for? We're not just managing it in some sort of abstract way. We're managing this knowledge to achieve something. And one of the things we heard this morning is that having clear objectives is central to monitoring and evaluation, is central to having a theory of change, is certainly central to having a strategic communications. People, one of the most important things I ever learned about communications was that the difference between strategic communications and non-strategic communications was in strategic communications, the emphasis is on knowing very, very clearly what is your objective, and then communicating to achieve that objective. So having these objectives is very clear, having clear objectives is fundamentally important. But once we realize that having clear objectives and being much clearer than we usually are about exactly what it is our objectives are, we also have to take into account that our objectives, once we're clear about them, are probably not the same objectives as the objectives of a lot of the people out there that we need to work with, build ties with, convince, change. We need to be very conscious of their objectives, and then we need to think very carefully, strategically, how do we build links between our clear objectives and their clear objectives? Now, one of the things that often becomes very confusing when we talk about theories of change and monitoring and evaluation is that the formal, explicit objectives are often quite different from the hidden agendas and the implicit objectives. I had a conversation with my father last night, and he was telling me, I can't understand why the conservation organizations don't do a better job of convincing the general public about their issues. And I told him that if you realize that the 5 largest conservation organizations are a $2 billion business, and that their objective is to continue to be a $2 billion business, then it's not surprising that they are focused on achieving being a $2 billion business rather than on educating the general public about conservation. And I say that not to critique those 5 organizations, because they're in the ecosystem and holding the places they do, which are very important places, because that objective is a legitimate objective. It is important for us to have these large conservation organizations out there. But if we don't understand that one of their objectives is to continue to be a $2 billion set of entities, we're not going to be able to understand their behavior, and we're not going to be able to interact with them in a strategic way to achieve whatever objectives that we might have. And then finally, let me talk about power. Now, I know that tomorrow is the day that we're going to be focused on power, but I think there were a number of things that came out this morning and other things that didn't come out this morning, which are key to the question of power and to leveling the playing field between groups that have traditionally been disadvantaged and discriminated against and groups that have traditionally been powerful and wealthy. Some of the things that came out this morning that were key in terms of power that I think that we need to remember is not just the importance of social capital and building social capital, but also the importance of building self-esteem. For groups, whether it be women, whether it be indigenous peoples, whether it be quilombolas, whether it be small farmers who have traditionally been discriminated against, traditionally been disempowered, building their self-esteem is a fundamental element of building their power. And another thing we heard this morning was that building networks is also key to building power. 3 things that we didn't hear this morning. One thing that I found amazing that I've gotten this far in this event and not heard about is social movements. I've heard about communities, governments, NGOs, academics. But building power is ultimately, from the base, from the ground, is ultimately about building social movements. I have heard nothing in the last 16 hours or whatever since we started about faith and faith communities. If we're going to reach people where they are for a large percentage of the world's population, we're talking about reaching their faith. We're talking about reaching their values. We're going back to their hearts and not just their minds. It was I had a real kind of wake-up moment on that question 3 or 4 years ago in a presentation that Tom Friedman made at the Ford Foundation. And somebody asked him a question about climate change. And he said some things, and then he said, well, you know, one thing you have to remember is that 40% of the people in the United States believe that the climate is in God's hands. And God, for better or worse, is going to work that out. If we don't address that, if we ignore that, if we pretend that's not science, that is science. That is the reality. That is the material fact, is that those people believe that that's the way they think. And that They're human beings and they're part of this process. And then finally, communications. It was astounding to see how few people raised their hand about communications. We shouldn't have another meeting about this without communications at the table. Thank you.
Thank you so much for each one of you. Emotion creates motion. Whenever you actually can go into what is that passion and what makes people's hearts beat. Emotion creates motion. But with that, we are actually we have a little bit of time for the last comments. If you want, you don't have to, but you have heard each other. And if there is something that someone said that you want to connect, because for example, business came then, and I don't know, you have like an open microphone to whoever wants to make a final wrap up of this section. So yes, I don't know where's the microphone. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Great comments, all of you. I particularly want to follow up on David's comments. I think you nailed a number of very key issues. But I really think we need to think collectively about the next phase, the next strategy for Amazon conservation. We're coming off a period where we know that command and control approaches can work. Beginning with the Pick a Sit Down, organized in President Lula's cabinet, and then other processes coming into that. But basically, sting operations, law enforcement, a lot of people went to jail. A lot of people received fines. We're also seeing the limits of that model as deforestation creeps up, even though, as Marcia Macedo's paper shows, soy continues to be zero deforestation, with decoupling there. So in one sense, we're reaching the limits of fear-based strategies for addressing the drivers of deforestation. If you look at most of the measures, it's fear of being imprisoned, fear of being cut off from markets, and in the case of the moratorium, the cattle agreement, fear of being cut off from credit in the case of municipios críticos. And there's another fear there that I just forgot. But I think we need those fears in place, but we're moving into a period that has to deliver carrots. And we have to find those carrots at scale, even in a world that has been very reluctant to put money on the table, with the wonderful exception of Norway, our oil-rich friends, and the home of my ancestors. So I think for a vision of what that looks like, it's clear too, I think, the lessons of the last 5 years, that every region needs its own tailor-made approach that resonates with the people of that region, that connects to the culture, the ecosystems, the traditions, the languages of that region, and its comparative advantage in a globalized economy. And I want to know how many people have heard of the Mato Grosso PCI? Raise your hands. Maybe half. Okay. If we're to look at it just in terms of climate change mitigation, it's the biggest thing out there if it were a national NDC, with the exception of maybe 2 or 3 nations. It's 6 billion tons of avoided CO2 by 2030. This is one state in Brazil because of reduced deforestation and reforestation. And what strikes me is, and it gets to some of the things David was pointing out, it has clear objectives. It has shared goals. It was done very quickly. Ana Pedronakis in a little meeting in Barcelona in June of 2015, followed by 6 multi-stakeholder dialogues, kicked off by the Minister of Environment of Norway, together with Isabella Teixeira and Governor Akis and other stakeholders up on the stage. The private sector going into that, they wanted to know, what is my risk? If I take on this ambitious target for removing deforestation from my supply chain, what are my current suppliers? Where are they already? How close am I to that? So they were preparing to join this thing. AproSoja mobilized, Agrimachi came in, that is displayed in these sectors. As far as I know, this is the first time that agro, the big ag, joined something that actually committed them to something beyond legal compliance. It's a big deal. Now that our work begins of translating that shared definition of success, which is not being imposed from the outside, it's not being driven by a Greenpeace campaign, and we certainly need Greenpeace to keep doing its campaigns, but it's rising from the bottom up. And I think we see that in Agri, we see that in San Martin. There's now a public-private coalition that is 50 partners in the Peruvian Amazon. And it's moving forward. It's coming into focus. And there's $300 million of climate money from the JP ready to come into that eventually. But we can really see glimpses of this next phase of our community, which is much more about connecting with the very powerful sectors with carrots and listening to their issues and peeling off layers of the Bautista so they come over. And we know that a lot of those folks are land stewards. We can easily out into farming and ranching just because they are land stewards and they love being on the land. So I pose that sort of the possibility of a next major phase.
We have like 5 minutes for like open microphone.
Yes, I finalized with the question how to integrate, and during the panel, one important tool that was my notes. That is one of the possibilities of providing a work for a larger platform, and I think this might be something that may provide achieving. But talking more broader perspective, and I think linking to what Dan said, in PCI is the production, conservation, and inclusion. So I think those letters really represent how and what we need to do in respect to the Amazon. I think these 3 words we cannot consider that production has not to exist with conservation, because our economy particularly is very significantly based on agribusiness. So not only agriculture, soy production, and all the other commodities, but also cattle. So we need to think a process of production chains that are clean, and how to engage private sector really in this agenda. Because I can see some movements, some important movements in the private sector, but I think if we don't have the end of the chain, the consumers' engagement, the consumers' requirement of a clean production chain, and if we don't have a strong legal framework that requires adherence to the law, if we don't have, for example, pushing the car inscription and the forest code deadlines. So because if we push deadlines, if we postpone requirements, the ones that did everything proper, they are in a sort of way punished, because they are seeing that the flexibility and not legal law enforcement, and that actually incentivizes the ones and the small number of ones that are not in a regular situation. So I think this in social inclusion at the end, we have to understand that a significant number of our population, and particularly in the Amazon, are still below the poverty level. So we need to consider that social inclusion, income generation, linking these income production chains to the market, but in a sustainable and respectful way, considering the safeguards related to traditional communities. It is a challenge that has to be faced and has also to be considered in a public policy strategy. So you also mentioned about the PPC done. I think also the PPC done, if you look deeply to the strategy, I think those axes are considered because we have sustainable production activity that is, in essence, to realize and to recognize that we have people living in the Amazon and have to live in a sustainable way and not in a poverty situation. We have the monitoring and control and punishment and the requirements of being adhering to the law. We have the land use regularization that is still a challenge in the Amazon that we haven't deeply faced yet. And so land regularization is still one of the main drivers of deforestation. I would say. And you have also the incentives, because the last version of this had included incentives, positive incentives or finance incentives, not only to punish the municipalities that are on the list of the ones that mostly deforest, but how do we stimulate the ones like the Iguaçu that was mentioned here, or Alta Floresta and Paragominas and other municipalities that are doing their part, that are mobilizing their rural associations, that are trying to be adherent to what the forest code says. So I think this is a challenge that we face, and I deeply think that we need the private sector engaged in this agenda in a more firmly manner with the research background that supports providing technical strategies, assistance, and capacity.
Okay, we really are going to have to go to break, but if you have a point to the point, what is that you want? If you want, you don't have to. But if you want to make the last point. Yeah.
There's one point is about transparency. It's high agenda that's not only for conservation group, but it's high for every single group that we want today. How to explicit, how to do transparency, how to provide information that's not biased. That's all like a root learn. Not easy. People are not getting money to do some real good statements because somehow it's against some of the people who pay for us to do the science. Because something that you have to keep a tight agenda, something like a really have to act pretty careful. Which about learning.
Just a couple words, also seeing the majority of Brazilians or Brazil oriented people here, think about the Amazon that is beyond Brazil, and the reality we face in the Andean countries is a very different one. So we need to always think that there is the other Amazon.